It's about history, policy, and impact. A new perspective on current affairs, bringing experience, insight, civility, and scholarship to the urgent issues of today. It's about our past, present, and future. Your host, Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist, Doug Blackmon. From the University of Virginia's Miller Center, this is American Forum.
Welcome back to American Forum. I'm Doug Blackmon. 50 years ago, in 1964, thousands of college students risked their lives during Freedom Summer, pouring into Mississippi, hoping to end racial discrimination by registering African Americans to vote. Joining us today is the central figure in that effort, Bob Moses, former field secretary of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, one of the most important civil rights organizations at the peak of the civil rights movement. He's also the founder of the Algebra Project, an initiative based on bringing the logic of mathematics to children in the most underserved schools in America. Thanks for being here. It's an honor.
Thanks.
Let's go back in time to 1963 and the lead up to Freedom Summer in 1964.
When the sit-in movement broke onto the American scene in February 1960, I'm teaching in New York City, and it mesmerizes me, and so I've got to go down and actually take a look at it. So my father's, one of his older brothers, Uncle Bill, is at right here in Virginia at Hampton Institute. And so on my spring break, I go down to see Uncle Bill, and the students at Hampton are demonstrating in Newport News. So I walk with them over and walk the picket line, and then Wyatt T. Walker comes from Petersburg down to give the mass meeting address and announces that the SCLC, King's organization, is going to set up an office in Harlem where I'm living. And so I get the information and make it to the organizing meeting for that office. And Bayard Rustin, who does the March on Washington, is the person who's setting the office up. So the rest of that spring, I go down every afternoon, like clockwork, from school and volunteer. And then I asked Bayard if he can put me together with some operation that King is doing. I'm thinking they're still in Alabama. So he contacts Ella Baker, who is then King's executive director of SCLC, and sends me to her in Atlanta. So I arrive in Atlanta and learn for the first time about SNCC, because I'm working in the office, but no one has ever said anything about SNCC in the SCLC New York City office. And so there's Jane Stembridge. She's a young white student from Union Theological Seminary in New York. And we kind of hit it off. And then during the summer, the coordinating committee for SNCC holds its meeting and says that they need to have a fall meeting in the fall, right? So Jane comes and asks me if I would do a scouting mission for SNCC. And so she and Ella put together an itinerary, send me on a bus, and I start moving across Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Ella's right there. She's running Dr. King's organization. She has all the contacts. She knows all these people. The question is whether the organization, as it was set up, was actually ready to use those contacts. Because King was, this is 1960, and King really hasn't got another campaign yet, right? So anyway, I mean, so she has the contacts, and she's with King, but...
You're 24, 25 years old at that point, right?
25.
And so you're sent out, this kind of new guy to the picture with a pretty different background than many of the other players, So you're sent out on this sort of solo trip to the darkest of places, Alabama and Mississippi, to figure out whether it's time yet and how to mobilize the folks who are out there, right?
Yeah, I have one mission, which is find anybody that's done anything, and Ella is the one who's giving me the names of the local contact, and see if they would come to the fall conference.
So here you are. You arrive in the Mississippi Delta to meet Amzie Moore, right? Amzie Moore, who's an NAACP leader in Mississippi.
He's head of the NAACP in Mississippi.
And he operates a gas station in this little town in the middle of the Mississippi Delta. That's why he's got...
Well, actually, so he owns a gas station.
Right.
When I get there, he's not actually operating it. He's
Okay.
kind of got somebody else running it. He's working in the post office. Actually, when I get there, I knock on his door. He's not home, right? And so I walk, somebody tells me he's at the post office, right? And so I walk over there, and Amzie has been reduced to 1 day a week at the post office, right? And that's
because
his
of
job,
his...
because of all that he does as, I mean, he's a race man, right? So he's identified in both communities, the black community and the white community. I mean, he sits, he has a little brick house, right? The only brick house on the street, right? And in a little backyard. And from the time I knew him, right, until I left, he sat in the back room at the window with his shotgun across his knees and the floodlights on his little backyard.
Anticipating.
Yeah, so he's a race man. But he's figured out how to thrive in struggle down there. Amzie began a different kind of education, right? Because he opened up this whole world that was not talked about. I had never encountered any study or anything, right, that described what was going on in Mississippi and the Delta, including the idea that there's a whole congressional district which has a majority black population eligible to vote that is not voting, right?
And has never elected an African American to Congress.
Never elected anybody and is just not part of the political process. And, you know, I'm up there at these really prestigious schools, and the conversation is about, you know, the Iron Curtain, not the Cotton Curtain. Right?
Mm-hmm. So what does he make? This guy who's worked his way up, first by working in and operating his own gas station. Now he's got this other job as well, but it's a self-made guy who's spent all of his life in the Mississippi Delta, I presume. What does he make of this skinny, handsome young man from Harvard who shows up one day?
He's not making anything of skinny and handsome. So
you were, though.
But Amzie's not making that, right? So Amzie's looking, and what's interesting, and he tells me this later, that he just didn't think that anyone who was coming with a Harvard background would be of any help, right? Because the first place was they would think that they would come down to tell him what was going on and how to change it, right? So, but I'm a kid who actually grew up listening to adults, right? I was a kid who, if my father said, let's go, I would go, right? And he liked to walk around Harlem and talk to people about what he thought were, he was, you know, the man in the street with an idea about what to do about the people who ran things, right? And he also schooled me about how to read people. So we would talk to somebody, and then he would talk to me about the educated fools.
And who were the educated fools?
Well, the people we talked to, right? Yeah, when some people who, so this whole idea that because you have an education, you actually know how to do something or how to think about solving problems. Yeah. So he schooled me about that. So I was really ready for somebody like Amzie, and Amzie became a kind of my father in the movement for me. And AMSI really, so there's a deep level of understanding which is not just of the mind, but of your whole body in some sense about what your situation is and what to do about it. And AMSI had studied both his people and white people in Mississippi and had figured out, right, what to do, how to do it, right.
Now, Mississippi at this point is a place that it's got lots of black people and it's got lots of black preachers. And the core of the civil rights movement, as people understand it at that time, is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and Dr. King emerging from the black church. But Dr. King doesn't really have activity. There's not an SCLC office in Mississippi. Why is that?
You know, Mississippi is sort of NAACP territory, right? And so I think that's another thing that, so King it's hard for him to get a foothold.
Well, so that's sort of what I think is interesting about this, is that it's this formative moment in the civil rights struggle where there are a lot of things going on at once and there are a lot of connections that haven't been fully made yet. There are kind of territorial issues that Dr. King and the SCLC are one operation, the NAACP, everyone is sympathetic to one another, but it's not all one umbrella.
Well, I tell you what, the person who schooled me on that issue was Webb Owens. So, you know, when I got back, I went to work with AMSI, but we weren't able to get off the ground right away, and we got a letter from C.C. Bryan, who was the head of the NAACP in Macomb, right?
Another down on the other side of Mississippi.
Right. Down in southwest corner of Mississippi. So AMSI sends me down there, and I'm living then with C.C. Bryan and his family, but every morning, Webb Owens, who is a retired railroad worker, has been to Tougaloo and really has a sense of what's going on, right? He's another sort of low-key race person, right? But, and he walks with a cane and he has a fisheye. He has a little thing on his glasses that keeps one of his eyelids up, right? So he's the treasurer of the NAACP in Macomb, and he keeps the money in his back pocket, right? Because you can't put it in a bank, right? And so he's a person that everyone trusts to give some money. They know that if they give the money to Webb and he says, this is what we're going to use it for, it gets used for that, right? So he picks me up and is following me around, I mean, going with me. We're meeting with anybody who has a local business that deals with the black community, right? And he says, you know, who I am, and says, I'm going to tell my story, and we're trying to raise money to bring in 2 SNCC field secretaries, right? But every day, he looks at me with his fisheye, and he says, Bob, I'm in the NAACP, I'm in SNCC, I'm in CORE, I'm in SCLC, I'm in anything that's going to get this monkey off my back. Right? And so he's schooling me that we have all got to, we may be divided in this and this and this, but in Mississippi, we've got one problem, and we need all of you to work on that one problem, right? And so we actually did, right? So the consensus was we should work on voter registration. That was AMSI's insight, right? That you guys need to come down here and do just that, right?
And so at the time, though, that you make this first trip to Mississippi and then you come back the next year after I'm sort of promised that you would, it's still the case that the national civil rights movement hasn't really quite reached Mississippi yet, except for the Freedom Riders.
After the Freedom Rides, SNCC has everybody's attention, right? From the president on down, and they want to figure out something that is a little less risky than what they've been doing, right, with the Freedom Rides.
And tell me if I get this summation wrong, or any details of it wrong, but so you end up first you go to southwest Mississippi, which is really it's the hill country of Mississippi. It's sort of hardcore, a kind of brutal kind of racial attitudes on the parts of whites. It's Klan country as opposed to Citizens Council country, a really dangerous place for someone like you to be. You go there by yourself, except for the support of the Mississippi leadership that you've discovered, or that you've become a part of. And then you end up in Macomb, and that's where the city of Macomb, and begin a voter registration effort there. And the Kennedy administration, as you were talking about a minute ago, is under the misimpression that that people won't react all that terribly to efforts to register African Americans in Mississippi, and that proves not to be the case at all in Macomb, right?
Right.
Yeah. So so you began taking people down to the courthouse to try to register them to vote, and what happens?
So it's different scenes. So we're starting out in Macomb. There, you know, we're going around and holding meetings. The Masons there, CC is part of the Masons also. They have a little brick two-story building, and the upper story, he lets us hold our meetings. And so people start to register. I think what happens is for them, they have to go down to the county seat, Magnolia, right? What happens for them is kind of pressure, economic retaliation. That doesn't really, the pattern of it comes out over time, right? That's the Justice Department comes in there and begins to collect depositions, right? But some people in the neighboring county, Amite County, Mrs. Scobie comes over and says she wants to go down to register to vote. Would we take her down, right? And so she and her brother and sister, I pile into the car with them. The brother's driving, and we go to Liberty, which is the county seat of Amite County. And so that's our first effort in this sort of really rural area, right? And I'm sitting on the courthouse steps. They are allowed in one at a time. It takes them quite a while to do it. And so we're there pretty much most of the day, right? And the highway patrol is parked down in front of the courthouse. When we leave, it follows us. When we cross the county line, it waves us down, right? And so I get out and ask, what's the matter? And then I take down the officer's name. He has his little card, his badge or whatever, right? And he yanks me and puts me in the car and takes me to Magnolia. They charge me with interfering with an officer in the discharge of his duties, right? So I've been told by Charlie Jones, part of the group of SNCC that's working on with the administration, that if anything happened, I should collect to John Doerr.
At the Department of Justice in Washington.
Right. So I say, can I make a phone call? And they say, yes. And so I pick it up, and I ask to speak with John Doerr, collect, right? And I luck out. He takes the call, right? And he talks to the registrar, not the registrar, the justice of the peace, whoever it is, right? So they drop the charges, but they say there's a cost of court. So I said, no, I'm not going to pay cost
$5,
of court.
right?
I don't know what it was, right?
$5.
But whatever it was, I wasn't going to pay it. And so I stay overnight in jail. They lock me up. And then the NAACP then sends down Jack Young. He comes down and gets me out. So that's big news, that it's not big news. It's not as, taking somebody down to register is local news, right? I mean, it's news for the people right there. But picking up the phone and getting a collect call through to the Justice Department means that somebody here has some connections that we weren't anticipating, right? And so that then spreads, so the newspaper the next day makes a collect call to the Justice Department, and they don't take it, right? So then Steptoe, who is the head of the NAACP and AMIT, contacts CC And Cece drives me out to Steptoe's, right? And Steptoe says, we want to set up this here. And so we start working in the rural there. It takes a couple of weeks, very few people. What the situation in Amet was that the sheriff had confiscated the books. I mean, you're dealing with the period after Brown, after the court decision about schools, right? And so Mississippi has decided that the NAACP is the #1 enemy, and it goes on really a campaign to eliminate NAACP activity and leadership. So they're murdering people, but in the Amet County situation, what they do is confiscate the books and get all the names of the people who are part of the NAACP, and so it disintegrates, right? The NAACP disintegrates as an organization in Amet, right? So, but Steptoe is still there, and he's the titular head of the NAACP there. And so he has a little church, he has some property. 3 brothers, right, are living on property, and then they have another little piece of property where they have a little church. And so we're meeting at the church. We're getting 5, 6 people, right, who are coming. And finally we get 2 people who say they are willing to go down, right? And so they swing by, one of them swings by Steptoe's early in the morning, picks me up, and we go to pick up the other one, Preacher Knox, and he isn't home. His driveway, it takes you, it takes you a half an hour to negotiate his driveway. I'm talking about the potholes, right? That it's like you're going up and down the country, the hillside, right? They say, well, he's already in Liberty. He's going to meet you at the courthouse. We get to the courthouse, he's not there, right? And they say, Preacher Knox, so he's over at the Cotton Gin. So we walk over to the Cotton Gin, and then the 3 of us are walking back to the courthouse. And as we're walking, 3 young white men come up, and one of them starts to attack me, right? So I go into this crouch, right? And I'm sort of waiting there. My memory of it is that I'm just crouching until it stops, right? And so it does stop, and I get up, and I learned something from my father. He told me, he was describing to me an incident where he was walking on the street, and someone was approaching him like he wanted to attack, and so what you do is you make your move and don't look back, right? And keep on walking. So I made my move. As soon as I got up, I just kept walking. I never looked back, right?
But you didn't fight back. You just ducked down, covered yourself.
I was doing, right, yeah, there's no fighting back. I mean, the fighting back is doing what I did, right? What I did was fight back, right? And so we walked down the street, and it's a surreal situation because there's a funeral going on while this is happening. And the funeral cars are slowly making their way down. There's only one street in the whole town, right? And it's making their way down the street, and there's a highway patrolman at the bottom of the hill who's directing the funeral traffic. And so I go up to him, I say, that guy up there, he just attacked me, and I'm bloody, right?
Yeah, you're bleeding. Your head's
right?
banged up.
Yeah, and he doesn't say anything. And so we walk on. Our goal is, it's really crazy. Your goal is the courthouse, right? And so we walk to the courthouse. The registrar comes out and says the courthouse, the registration is closed for the day, and slams the door. Dr. Anderson, who is the only black doctor in the whole Southwest there, sews me up. He says he took 8 stitches, right? I called Jack Young, who is the black attorney who had come down to get me out of jail before, and he tells me, what you have to do is contact the county attorney. This is a case he has to take. And so the next day we go in and look him up, and he tells me what happened. He says, that was Billy Jack
So
Caston.
before you get there, the prosecutor already knows who actually
well,
did it.
everybody knows, right? Everybody knows what's happened. We're the only people that don't know, right? And so he says, it's Billy Jack Caston. He's the nephew of the sheriff. And he hit you, and he had a knife, but it wasn't open. It was closed, right? And he said he would take the case, right? And so the next day, we're back in town. There's a justice of the peace jury that they've assembled, and the courtroom fills up with white men with their guns, right? And the sheriff tells us, as soon as we finish, we go and testify one at a time. He says, well, before the jury gives the decision, you guys just need to leave, right? And so we leave, and you know, everybody is waiting to hear what everybody knows the decision will be, right?
Which was?
But I never heard it, right? I mean, as far as I know, there was no, right.
But so those first efforts that look sort of promising at the beginning, at least it looks like the Department of Justice there's gonna be some support there that hadn't been before.
We raised enough money to bring 2 people down. Reggie Robinson came and he stayed in Macomb. John Hardy came and he went to Walthall, and then I went to AMET, right? So Hardy was taking Ruby McGee down to register to vote in Tylertown, right? And Ruby is a college-educated young black woman whose family has a farm and is fairly well off in Walthall, right? And on the way out, the registrar is furious and slams his pistol up against Hardy's head, right? And Hardy staggers out into the street looking for the sheriff, and the sheriff is looking for him, right? And he arrests him and says he was causing all this trouble, right? And so the Justice Department now decides that they want to do something really unusual, which is intervene in a criminal case before it's tried and stop it, right? So get the feds to go into the state process and say, no, you can't do this. And so John Doe is coming down to look at that case and stops by Steptoe's, right? And he looks at me and he's shocked because I have these bandages on my head. And so John asks, well, Steptoe, well, who are the people who are in danger? And Steptoe gives him a list, right? The next day, I'm back in Macomb. Dr. Anderson is there, right? He comes over, he says, Bob, I just got a call. They picked up a body outside of the Cotton Gin in Liberty, and I want you to go down with me because they want to identify it. And he's thinking that, well, if a black person was killed in the Cotton Gin, shot at the Cotton Gin, it must be related to what the activities we were doing, right, the voter registration. So we go down, and it's Herbert Lee, right? It's
one of the people on the list.
Well, one of the people on the list, and the person who was driving Steptoe and I, Steptoe didn't have a car, right? So Herbert Lee had a pickup truck, and he was the one that drove us around. And Eugene Hurst, who was a member of the Mississippi State Legislature, had followed him down to the Cotton Gin and shot him right there in cold blood, right in front of everybody.
You get beaten that time. You get severely beaten another time too, don't you, later? There's another time you're physically accosted. This fellow ends up dead. After all of these terrible things have happened, and all of the things that American citizens should have been able to assume would be there for you, the protections of the federal government, that the courts would be available in some manner. After all these things have happened that against you and obstacles put in the way, how is it that the decision is made? We've actually demonstrated that something very powerful can happen here, and this is something worth doing on an even bigger scale that will have even bigger impact.
SNCC is helping to engineer really the first big demonstration of young people in the state of Mississippi, right? And so that happens that fall, And it's an important event in the sense that about 18 of us end up in jail. We're in jail for about 39 days. What it meant was from that time on, it was clear that in Mississippi, SNCC was just going to do voter registration. That the idea that you were going to do direct action and mobilize, any significant number of young people to, to march or to sit in was not going to happen, right? Because there was no buffer zone, right? The middle class that allowed it to happen in Atlanta and Nashville and places like that didn't exist in Mississippi. So you weren't going to be able to, you were looking at long-term jail sentences, right?
You've also seen it is an incredibly disruptive kind of direct action in its own way. Just the voter registration is obstructing the system in powerful ways. But so let's come back in a minute, though, to the sort of the story of that. But before we do that, I want to ask you some other things that are a little less specific to the narrative. One is just that through this whole period of time, did you go to Mississippi imagining that there was some fairly reasonable probability that you might never come back, you might lose your life?
Well, so the question of life and life threats arose with Herbert Lee's murder, right? He had 7 young children, right? In some sense, the action that we, were involved in precipitated that murder, right? And so at that point, I think all that we could do really was decide that we were going to figure this out. We were going to stay and do this work, right, regardless, right? They would, in effect, they would have to kill us to get us out of there. But you're not talking about a lot of people. You're just talking about a few people there that was,
But on an individual basis, you sort of made a pact with yourself that you were willing to.
I was going to do this.
Willing to have that happen.
I would not have that happen, but do this work. Yeah, whatever, right?
And then again, without necessarily the organizational details of exactly how Freedom Summer happens, but once it does, and once this very large number of mostly white kids from outside the South, not all white kids, but become a part of Freedom Summer, come down, go through some version of this experience. But you in particular become this, for many of that generation, many young people of that generation, you become this kind of, I'm sure you don't like the term, but this almost messianic sort of figure. The New York Times in a piece once referred to you as the Martin Luther King of Mississippi. But why was that? You're this soft-spoken guy that not full of bravado in any sort of manner. Why was it that you became such a central figure to them?
I wasn't that when it happened. Right?
You are an elusive subject of an interview.
So, and it's interesting, a lot of, and, I look back on that person now, right? And
the person you were.
That person. Not the person I was, the person that became a historical person, right? Ella Baker really did something that was really seminal for me and I think for many of us. She delineated a separation between leadership and organizing in the sense that from the beginning, she was helping to create the space so that the sit-in people could have their own leaders. And she was not going to be one of those leaders, right? But she wanted very much for that leadership to emerge, and she helped create a space so they couldn't become just the youth wing of King's organization or another youth wing for CORE, right? That they deserved to have their own autonomy as a space, right? And so somehow that sensibility took hold, and I don't think of it as something that took hold consciously, right? But it took hold in terms of the actual day-to-day work that we were doing.
Let me ask you, we're going to do something special in just a minute, but I want to ask you before we do, one other kind of philosophical thing, but it's also part of your story. Freedom Summer has this dramatic, transformative events in American life in '64. But then after Freedom Summer, we get into '65 and thereabouts, you pull out. You pull away from the mainstream of the civil rights movement. You change your name, and you end up in Tanzania as a teacher for a pretty long period of time. And for a lot of people, you kind of vanished. You know, a lot of people who'd been following you through that mediated version of you, you vanished. Why was that? What was happening there?
Well, you have to go all the way back to when I turned 18. So I turned 18 in January of 1953, and the country has a draft, right? And I'm a young kid who's thinking about, well, how do I position myself vis-a-vis this country, right? Based on my experiences so far. And so I write to my draft board that I don't think I want to fight in any of the up-and-coming wars, right? And so...
The war is yet to be named.
Right, yeah. We just finished the Korean War, right? And one of my really close friends that I grew up with was murdered there. He didn't come back. So the draft board, I have a Harlem draft board, so they give me student deferments, right, all the way through college and into graduate school. And then, remember, 1957, Sputnik happens, right? The Russians send that monkey up into space, right? And so this country gets all excited and says it has to catch up, right? And one of the ways to catch up is to give deferments to people who are teaching math, right? And so when I leave graduate school and I end up at Horace Mann, I'm teaching math. So I still get my deferment. As soon as I go to Mississippi, they call me up for a hearing, right? And they tell me that, you know, you don't have a religious basis for your position, and I'm assigned 1A. So all the time that I'm down there, I'm 1A, right? 1965, Tom Hayden comes through and says with the Student for Democratic Society that they're going to have their first nationwide student protest about Vietnam. And he knows about my draft situation and says, will you speak? So I speak. And then I spend some time moving around, really trying to look at, well, all the kids who came down during '64, many of them could be the basis for protests about Vietnam, because the old peace movement that I had been sort of on the fringes of, had gone to meetings during the '50s, Quakers, Bayard Rustin, Fellowship of Reconciliation, they were all kind of wrapped up in the war on poverty and the Johnson administration, so they weren't really able to take a lead on this issue. So I do that, and then in 1966, I'm ordered to report, right? And so I decide that I'm not going to report. I'm also not going to stay in this country and follow its madness, right? And so I leave, right?
Let's pause right there for a second, and we're going to come back in just a minute with another legend of the civil rights movement. And so now we're back with Bob Moses, one central, seminal figure in the events of the Civil Rights Movement in the middle of the 1960s, and now we're joined by Julian Bond, another leader in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, someone who's involved, I think, particularly in the organizing around Freedom Summer in 1964, but then another figure who goes on to remarkable renown as a civil rights figure and an American leader elected to public office to the Georgia legislature, then refused your seat in the Georgia legislature a few years later, and then years beyond that as head of the NAACP for many years. So thank you for becoming a part of this conversation.
My pleasure.
Well, let's go back to this moment in time that we were talking about before, earlier in the program, of the lead up to Freedom Summer '64. Bob Moses has been down in Mississippi, sort of stirring things up, making connections. A momentum has built. A lot of bad things have also happened, but a decision is made somewhere, somehow, that this enormous effort is going to be undertaken in the summer of '64.
Yeah. So we should pick up the story. What happened when Medgar was murdered?
Medgar Evers.
Medgar Evers was murdered.
Yeah.
So we get back up into the Delta in '62, right? Amzie says, he comes down to Jackson and says, we're ready to move in the Delta, right? I've been doing the campaign work with R.L.T. Smith, right? And so we're recruiting young people from Macomb and from Jackson and Hattiesburg, and Amzie is helping us deploy them in the Delta. And so that work begins across '62 and '63. '63, in February of '63, we're grease-gunned, right? Jimmy Travis, myself, and Randolph Blackwell, right? And Julian has his little article in the Student Voice, right? His little report, right?
By the way, just so people are clear, grease-gunned is machine gunned, right? Yeah, bang, 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 bang.
Bang, 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 yes. Right. So we converge on Greenwood. Hundreds of people go down to register for food, right, basically, right? The LaFleur County is cut off, the commodities, and we raise food up in Chicago, and we tell people, well, if you want some food, you have to go down to register. Of course, the reason you don't have your food is because you're not involved in this political process, right? So we're arrested. I'm sitting in the witness stand. The courtroom we bust over sharecroppers from Greenwood into Greenville, right? And John Doerr is in front of me. He's my lawyer, and Judge Clayton is the federal district judge. He leans over and he wants to know, why is SNCC taking illiterates down to register to vote, right? So sharecropper illiteracy and education is really the subtext of this voter registration issue, right? Because we had decided that if somebody wants to go down, right, then they need to go down. It doesn't matter about whether or not they can read, right? And so basically we tell him, well, you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't deny the whole people access to literacy through politics and then turn around and say, well, you can't do politics because you're illiterate, right?
So we've had this acceleration of activities. We've had Medgar Evers' death, we've had Kennedy's promise of a civil rights legislation, and then we've had the March on Washington, and then after that, of course, we have, a few months later, we have the president's assassination. And so this great surge of interest and activity among a much larger group of people, real focus on the civil rights movement that's now taking us into the beginning of '64. But so, Julian, you're primarily, you're in Atlanta a lot of the time, you're in the sort of organizing leadership element of SNCC. What's, as from the perspective of Atlanta, this guy, Bob Moses, who had headed off into Mississippi a few years earlier, and these things have begun to grow out of some of these efforts. What's the perspective of this guy from those of you in Atlanta?
Well, first let me mention, Bob mentioned Judge Clayton. I think Judge Clayton is the man who said from the bench that the NAACP stood for niggers, apes, alligators, coons, and possums. He's a federal judge. So you see what we're up against there.
Astonishing.
Bob may not like this, but he was a mythical figure in SNCC. And I tell you, he had a habit when he spoke of doing like this. And soon everybody in SNCC was doing like this. Everybody. doing like that. That tells it all.
But so, as these conversations about the summer project for 64, as some consensus begins to build that there's an opportunity and some resources for something big in 64, how do we finally get to the trigger being pulled, the button being punched of what that's going to be?
Bob knows that more than I.
Actually, we get to it with another murder. You go back to Herbert Lee, right? And Herbert Lee's murder, Amzie came down when Herbert Lee was murdered, and we spent the week, every night, we'd wait till it get dark, and then Amzie would drive out with me looking for witnesses. We found one person, Lewis Allen, right? And Lewis Allen became the witness that testified about the murder. And he was hounded. The sheriff broke his jaw. They locked him up. They were ruining his business. He was, he did lumber, went down. And then they finally murdered him. And so they murdered him in January of 1964. And for me, that was like the bookend, right? We had now started out with Herbert Lee. We couldn't do much in response to that except commit ourselves. But now we were actually able to envision calling on the country to come down and take a look at itself, right, through its Mississippi eyes, right? And so there was a big debate within the field staff and within SNCC about whether or not to do the summer project. But for me, we were, and part of what was going on was the reaction across Alabama and Mississippi, because remember, you had the church bombing, right, after the March on Washington, right? Those 4 little girls were bombed away in the church in Birmingham. And then you had a series of church burnings and terrorism across Alabama and Mississippi, all that fall, right? So it's like we were sitting there, we were sitting ducks, right? The country had announced, the president, it was going to go after civil rights legislation, and the white South was reacting, right? And terror was going through. There was nothing to stop it, right? And so all of that was going on, and then, but really, it was Lewis Allen's murder that made me say, well, yeah, no, we can do something different now, and we need to do it.
We've only got a little bit of time left. Julian, now here we are 50 years later. Did you imagine 50 years ago that we would, at this stage, be where we are or someplace very different?
I'm not sure if I remember well enough to say what I thought would happen. The civil rights movement, if you think about the sit-ins, and then you think about the freedom rides, and then you think about the 64 Act, and then you think about the 65 Act, these things happen pretty quickly together. And I think many of us thought they should have occurred quicker than that, but nonetheless, this was a quick succession of events, and it was wonderful, and in the future, these things would happen. Well, after the Voting Rights Act, these things sort of slowed down, and the climate sort of slowed down, and we're still waiting for it to pick up and speed up now. So things just didn't move as quickly as we moved first, quicker than I thought they would, and then not as quick as they should.
And Bob, you were in that same period of time that, one, you were trying to avoid being sent to Vietnam because of your feelings about the war, but you also had some disaffection with the movement in that period of time too, or at least that's part of the mythology. And you also, at least it's written in various places, that you went through a period where you said you didn't want to work with white people anymore, and you didn't think white people should be part of the movement. Obviously, I think if that was the case, your views on that have changed. But what was happening then too?
The Freedom Summer actually triggered the conversation in SNCC that it has now got to rethink, right, what it's doing and how it should do it, right? And I listened in on that conversation maybe, well, almost a year, a little more than a year, right? And it was a moving conversation from, and so it was the kind of role that I was part of in SNCC, which was really a decentralized, sort of local autonomy around a consensus about purpose, right? Namely, the voter registration. That kind of disappeared. The idea was to have something which was more tightly run. And so that wasn't something that I felt like I was really comfortable. And in some sense, my work was done. I had come down to work with AMSI on his voter registration project for SNCC. And I felt like, well, that's been done. That part of the work has been done, right?
I hope this isn't too much of a cliche of a question, and maybe it's where we can wrap up. But about the same time that many of these events were occurring, Bobby Kennedy was asked a question at some point about whether the country could ever have a black president. He said that he thought there probably could be one in maybe 40 years. And then Dr. King was asked about Bobby Kennedy's comment. Dr. King said, well, actually, there are a lot of people, a lot of African Americans, or Negroes, he would have said at the time, who are capable and ready to be president today, but because of the problems we have, it may take 20 or 25 years for us to have the first black president. I think that's a good paraphrase. It turned out it was more like 45 years, but Bobby Kennedy was closer to being right. But with that having been accomplished, what's your view now that we moved toward the end of the first African American presidency? Has it turned out to be the capstone on this period of American history that maybe it was imagined to be 50 years ago?
Well, I hope not. I didn't believe that Barack Obama would win the presidency. I thought it was foolish for me to vote for him because this is a wasted vote. That would not happen. And it wasn't until he won in Iowa, this whitest of white states, that I thought this was possible and that he could do it. And of course, as we know, he did. And I really think the second election was more important than the first because he's running on a record now, not on promises, but on a record. And he did it. And I thought it was a wonderful, wonderful thing. And he's been, to me, a disappointment in some ways and has not done some things I wish he would have done or have done things I wish he hadn't done. But I think it's been a wonderful thing for the country to happen. And I think for the country, it's a step forward. But it's only a step. And we need to take many, many more steps. And the steps don't necessarily include electing another black president, although they could.
And Bob, what's your sense? And we literally just have a few minutes. How do you feel about where we stand in the country today in terms of Barack Obama? Or just are we on the path that we should be on? Or are we any nearer where we should be?
So let me say what I think about the country. Right. So I think about the country in terms of 3/4 of a century units of time, right? And I think we're celebrating 50ths. So 50 is 2/3 of 75, right? And so we're in our third 3/4 of a unit century of time, right? And if you think about the preamble, right, the We the People, and you think that as we began, 1787, we began with the reach of the preamble, who the We the People were, the constitutional people, were the white male property owners, right? And you go for 3/4 of a century, and the constitutional people have a huge falling out with each other over their constitutional property, right? And they murder each other, 600,000, right?
Over slavery.
Over slavery, constitutional property, right? And so, but the country can't quite figure out that the former constitutional property should really be constitutional people. And we go with what your book says, slavery by another name, for 3/4 of a century, right? And we get the civil rights movement, and we lurch, right? We're a country that lurches, but we lurch back and forward in roughly, so far, every 3/4 of a century, right? And so we're lurching right now, right? It isn't clear whether we're going to lurch forward again or lurch back, right? But we're going to lurch.
Well, and I think that's a good place for us to end with a mathematician, a philosopher, a leader, and an American hero. Thank you both for being here.